This panel is entitled The Impact of Unauthorized Scraping on Industry. Our moderator is Hemu Nigam. He's a partner here at Venable LLP. Mike Clark, the Director of Product Management for Privacy Infrastructure at Meta, is one of our panelists. Veronica Torres, who's the Worldwide Privacy and Regulatory Counsel at Jumio Corporation, is with us as well. And Doug Hudson, who's the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Etsy, has joined us today as well. Thank you.
Just introduce myself. My name is Hemu Nigam. I'm a partner, as Sarah just said, at Venable LLP, but I've also been working in the privacy, safety, security space now for 30-something years. I think 31 years, just to be precise in case, so that people don't think it's 39 years. So 31 years, and a lot of the work I've done has actually been.
You gotta turn your switch on.
Oh, is that what it is? Oh, and they don't know about the switch. How about now? Am I real? Am I alive? So I've been working in the privacy, safety, security space for 31 years. One of the areas I focused on was actually online crimes, and then going after movie pirates in the online space, worked inside of Microsoft, News Corp, Fox, and MySpace. And especially at a time when MySpace was hitting the world with tons of data out there, and people were starting to realize the value of the data. We have with us a pretty distinguished panel here. And I will say first, I want to point out Veronica's title. I have not seen a cooler title, Worldwide Privacy and Regulatory Counsel. But why don't we take a minute for each of you to introduce yourselves? And Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm live. I didn't have to turn on the switch. Mike Clark, I am a product director at Meta. Most of my career, I've been either an engineer or built startups or worked at Photobucket and MySpace and some online security spaces as well. At Meta, I specifically work on our privacy infrastructure space, which one of the things that we do is build anti-scraping both technology in addition to investigate and enforce and take steps against anti-scraping, and how we deal with third-party data and data lifecycle management and a whole bunch of fun stuff.
I am Veronica Torres. I am Worldwide Privacy and Regulatory Counsel, as well as Data Protection Officer for Jumio. I'm also from Miami, so I had a lot of friends make the Miss Worldwide jokes through Pitbull. So that just means, the title just means that I run the privacy program and I'm responsible for our global operations. It's been great. I started my privacy career at Nielsen way back when in law school under Elise Burkauer, actually. It was a great opportunity, jumped straight into privacy. I worked for Sony. My previous position was at ComScore, which is Nielsen's biggest competitor, which was a nice little full cycle moment in my career. And I was chief privacy officer there. So working on a lot of different issues with web scraping as to whether we're allowed to, whether people are scraping our websites, and what data is out there as well.
I'm Doug Hudson. I'm DGC Global Regulatory at Etsy, handling security, privacy, and other regulatory issues that are just kind of exploding worldwide. Before that, I spent some time at Twitter, and before that at Google, handling a kind of a diversity of these issues. And over the last decade, just privacy and security have become more and more of the focus of my practice. I think while I'm here completely on my own behalf and not on the behalf of Etsy, you know, one thing I've noted is, and other panelists have mentioned, the impact not just on platforms, but on end users, that both for their professional lives and personal lives, malicious scraping can impact their livelihood, can impact their safety. And I think that's part of hopefully some of the points we can address in this panel.
So actually, that brings us to a wonderful segue to the question. Stu this morning or this afternoon when we started said that the Mitigating Unauthorized Scraping Alliance, now I think it's going to be officially known as MUSA. When it was started, it was because it was ripe for a conversation, a public dialogue. But that happened because there has been an increase in unauthorized scraping over the past several years, if not the past decade. So my first question goes to Veronica, which is, why do you think that is?
Because it's easier is the answer. 10 years ago, it wasn't as easy. It took a lot of effort, both from the unauthorized scraper side or the public research side. It took a lot of effort to figure out, how do we get this data? Where is it? what's valuable. You're looking at code that has tons of information that's not structured. And so you're having to pull out your own data. Nowadays, it's as easy as you were saying, Mike, that like you can go onto AWS and there are tools for scraping and there are tools for things online. It's very similar. Coben and someone else earlier spoke to, ChatGPT, OpenAI, types of tools like that that are now with the common man and common woman. And they're in this place now that you can just access them instead of having to develop them on your own. So I think that's probably why it's more common.
Mike, you've been in this industry for a while, as you said.
Yeah, I'm a recovering scraper. I think 12 years ago I scraped, but it would have been MUSA. It was authorized scraping. Built a startup in child protection for helping identify public content that could potentially create harm to your child, your family. And it was hard, like having to build and integrate with 180 sites and how to integrate that data and get authorization was a lot of heavy lifting that today, without authorization, would be a lot easier. But I think there was some fundamental shifts that happened within the last 10 years. And I think one of them has to do with as GDPR came to be, as companies looked at the APIs that they started putting out in the late 2000s, there was a lot of data attached to these APIs, and companies built, whether it was in advertising, whether it was in surveillance, whether it was in a variety of different spaces, companies built entire businesses, got public funding and and VC funding around this space. As GDPR came to be, as Cambridge Analytica happened, so came this pressure to cut off the data that was going out through these APIs. But the economic incentive to have this data and use this data and sell this data and the marketplaces that had been built didn't change overnight. And so overnight supply goes away, but demand was on an increasing trajectory. And that's why we've seen, or that's at least for me, why I've observed both for Meta, for the industry, like that's where I really observe a lot of this coming from, is that by cutting off the supply, none of us did anything to address it. And I think it's also where we're all being held accountable for still providing the supply of data, which the supply of data is what we all require in order for our products to even work or function. And just that's a really hard spot to be in. I do have to say, like, if we treat this like therapy for a moment, we're not alone. Like, it's really great to hear like people thinking about it, both people that are scrapers, people that are representing scrapers, people that have companies and platforms. We're all in the same boat, and that is one nice thing about today as well.
So let me ask, and this is going to be a question for all of you, so get ready. But let me start with Doug. One of the biggest things every company faces is issues in security, issues in privacy, issues in safety. So when you put that in context, how big is this problem versus the world of problems out there?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about scraping, it kind of falls in three groups. You've got malicious bad actor scraping. You've got, which we started talking about, then you've got the competitive/consumer scraping. And then at the bottom, you have like researchers who need data. For the reasons that Mike put forward, I think the risk for malicious scraping has gone up by orders of magnitude. You press a button and you can fire something up with AWS. You're hidden behind some AWS IP blocks, maybe CloudFront behind that, and then you're in some other country. So you can create 1 million web pages based on stolen data in a minute. This is impossible for any one platform, no matter how big or small, to really counter on their own. You're not going to be able to send takedowns on that scale. And that content may not be in the content, maybe your user's content. So it's not going to be an old-fashioned DMCA takedown. You can go to a Cloudflare, but the norms aren't there. It's like, oh, this is a phishing site, please remove it. What do you do when there's 100,000 of them? So the malicious issue, I think, is across industries and across platforms, one where the seriousness of it is kind of escalating. For the competitive side, I think that's an area where we have to be awfully careful about how we implement regulation. There are side effects that may be unintended, some of which were talked about in the prior panel, but I think are worth exploring. But I think that may come in with a later question.
So Veronica, what's your take on this? Because you're worldwide, as you said, as we all said now 3 times, at Jumio. But so where do you put this in the context of all the other challenges that you face?
I think it depends on your industry and what your company does. We don't have a public platform for individuals. There's no publicly available public or personal information on our websites other than contact info for me. So this is, that's the information people are going to be scraping from us, but it's more that competitive side and that competitive information, what they're doing with it. And so I think it really depends on what your threat vectors are, what you're looking at to prevent, and then implementing programs that address those issues. It's really it varies across every industry, I think.
Mike, you're the opposite. There is public information on Meta.
Well, I think what was interesting is you use some other examples like privacy and security and other things that have very clear frameworks. There's academic frameworks. There are, I think I drove by 7 buildings along the Dulles Tollway that I recognized as, MITRE and other companies that have built their entire existence around the definition of frameworks and enforcing those. It doesn't exist for scraping. I think as I've heard the conversations today, like the one thing that came out is there've been 12 speakers so far, and there's 12 different definitions of what scraping is. I think there's the impression that it's just websites, and that's what it started off as, but now it's first-party APIs. It's the API intended only for my application or my website to talk to my servers, and it's not that. And that's what makes this extra hard. It's what adds this additional complexity to everything that we're talking about here today and throughout it, because if none of us have the same definition, it means that when the statement earlier, scraping isn't a data breach. And as a platform, as a consumer, when you see a large data set, like it's the first thing that comes to mind because it's what we've been trained for the last 15 years, and it's not what's actually there. So you two covered most of the topics, but just adding that on top of that, that's part of what makes this so difficult.
And so, I think what I'm hearing, and I've been hearing all morning, I keep saying morning, because I'm in LA time still, is that this is a growing problem. I think a lot of times in the online world, a lot of problems grow over time. This one is now ripe for real public dialogue that we're kind of having right now. The question that also raises, why do threat actors scrape? And I know some people have touched on it, but from starting with you, Mike, since you're closest to me, why do they do that?
Well, I think one of it goes back to the economic side. Like there are commercial businesses to be built around this data, and that's part of it. I think there is surveillance. There's a wide variety. I think it's examples that are out there publicly, that examples that we've shared and talked about of countries, of nation states building platforms to try and scrape data of citizens from adjacent countries and use for a tactical advantage. It is a wide variety. It's things that, as all of our systems converge into like being able to use many points of data to make decisions, as we're talking about with OpenAI and ChatGPT today, as we watch and observe, the ability to look at patterns of things that are happening, make predictions in markets, or, the claims of surveillance companies to make what kinds of crimes are people going to commit, the kinds of things that used to be in sci-fi movies 15 years ago, we now see companies making claims about. But this is what's driving this market to scrape it. We also have researchers, and we have a bunch of other reasons that are driving it as well. But it's economics that are driving a lot of it.
So, Doug or Veronica, do you want to add?
I just think you have, because we talk about unauthorized scraping, I think it sounds very negative and it sounds very like, oh, you're not supposed to do it. But there are very, earlier panelists have talked about the public good, scientific research. Just because it's unauthorized doesn't mean there is not a purpose to the scraping. And so, Doug here had your tiers. You have your malicious, so trying to create false competitive websites, phishing, things like that to access data. you have your competitive nature, building products either for a good because you think that there is a place in the marketplace for another product that utilizes this because you want to be competitive, maybe a little maliciously towards other big box retailers, or the public good side. So it's a very much, just because it's unauthorized doesn't mean that there's not a purpose to it. And threat actors have a variety of reasons for doing it. So it's you really have to take a look at what the result of the scraping is, not just the scraping.
And you were nodding your head so many times, I have to say, what do you have to add to that?
So this kind of goes back to what everyone here has been saying. For the malicious folks, to fire something up is incredibly cheap and incredibly quick. So until things change, where the cost of committing those bad acts is more than what they get from phishing people and fake transactions and selling people's personal information. And we were able to create friction from technical, legal, and cooperation with governments and via industry norms. It's not going to change. That is one area for the last panel. I agree. Technical changes have to come first because on the malicious scale, it's the only way in the short term you're going to increase costs for what's increasingly becoming part of multinational crime syndicate stuff, not just somebody just setting up a site. You're seeing things done at scale to the largest platforms that are out there sometimes, and we need a solution. For the other two areas, like I said, I think the solutions are different, and we really have to be careful of trying to fit a single piece of legislation to solve all three problems, because you're going to get lots of unintended side effects.
Mike?
I will just add back into that though. I think our dependency or kind of reliance on just technical solutions, from what I've observed, is too early. I think you can depend on technical solutions when there's very clear frameworks and there's things that we can all align on where purpose comes from, where consent comes from, how the purpose of research may have a very high value to society, but to me as a consumer be very risky. And looking at the dating examples, looking at some of the other examples out there, it's without that connection from who originated the data and who controls and owns the data to the platform is a pretty tough spot to be. And I think there's also this misconception that technology scales, that I think we all want to depend on it. We want to depend upon rate limits, but rate limits don't actually make determinations on scraping. It's merely increasing the cost of acquisition of data. I think when we look at bot detection, it's very, very nascent, because the same model used to train what would look like malicious activity is the same model that the other person can run to actually make it look more like a human. And so there isn't a gap between those. And I think we've talked about in some of our posts the billions of transactions, many billions of transactions that we block every day. And it is because it's adversarial, because it's economic, people are going to change, and technology can't keep up with that change. And so changing that we have an expectation of consequences, whether that's through regulation, whether that's through litigation, whether that's through consumer response and activities, is really a challenge. I, as a consumer, can't go affect Clearview AI unless I live in specific jurisdictions that action has been taken against them. And so it really leaves me powerless on how my face is being used by them.
And so that raises actually another area which is even more interesting. That we already have challenges in technical implementation. We have challenges in understanding what type of data it is, the purpose of the data. But often we hear people saying, oh, it's a privacy issue. Oh, it's another security breach. What is the reaction of you all when it comes to that? Whoever wants to start first. Is it a security breach? Why not? Is it a privacy breach? Why or why not? Or is it something else?
From my perspective, I start, okay, who let this happen? And not from an accusation standpoint, but if someone is scraping, I'm wondering how and what they're able to access. And so from the first start is what's out there on our websites, what's out there on our properties that others can gain access to, and then how can we move forward to prevent that access going forward? Are there any legal ramifications we can, or legal things we can take that would prevent this party or parties in the future from doing that? But it's first an internal inventory of what we're doing, what data is there, whether it's competitive data, whether it's personal data, looking at how that is architected, how it's structured, so that our security teams can come in and say, oh, well, that S3 bucket didn't have the right access controls and it was sitting in an open space for everybody to access. Or say, no, we had everything in place, but it was just, luck of the draw at this point and the technology is too advanced to fix it. So I'd start with a personal inventory of what that looks like and then assess from there. Because it's not always straight to, this is the worst thing that has happened to us in the past week. There's usually more fires than that. So it's really assessing in the context of what data is actually being scraped.
And I think reading between what you just said, you're almost saying it was publicly open, therefore it's not a security breach. Mike, do you have a reaction to that?
I think in some of those cases, I'll date myself in tech by, I think working on sites that I did at the time and projects that I did, when security was coming to be an issue, it was, very obvious that somebody was within a boundary that they weren't supposed to be, which started from like a connectivity layer. Like this person can actually touch a system that they shouldn't have been able to from a connectivity to the internet, and firewalls and other things matured. But it's really taken 15, 20 years for security to mature to a space that it made sense. There are very strongly developed frameworks. There's all these things that exist where we all have a clear understanding of what is a security violation and what is not. Privacy, on the other hand, when it came, privacy is ultimately the expression of a consumer's control over their content. Who should see this content? Who should have control of my data? How should it be processed? And that with, MySpace, and you must cause that, and PhotoBucket, YouTube, and Flickr, and all the sites that came out about that same time, really helped establish some of the early privacy foundations. And we've taken what security took 20 years to mature, and it took privacy, another 10 years to mature to GDPR and other things that are governing this expression. There's very clear frameworks around privacy. When we look at scraping, I think you look at scraping, you look at inauthentic behavior, and you look at a series of this new problem space. We're in this third generation of problem that is, it's lacking in those entire frameworks. It's built on a per company basis. It's defined on a per company policy perspective. I'm really glad that MUSA is here, that we're starting to kick off these conversations on how do we talk about these things as an industry and not just as an individual company's definition of what this is, which is part of where litigation has been so complex. It's part of where enforcement has been so complex. It's part of why the engagements with the academic community is extremely complex in getting to that. And so when I look at these examples that we're talking about, it is this new class of problem. It's not a privacy problem. It's not a security problem. It's not a data breach in the definition of what these are. But if we don't address it, we as platforms and we as consumers both lose.
And to clarify, it might not be a violation of that actor's, there might not be a violation from that actor that's not authorized scraping if that's open, but it's still a violation internally of policies and controls, maybe even contractual issues, if your privacy notice says certain things about their security levels. So there's still I don't use the word breach, but an incident that we need to address. It's just not necessarily something that could be actionable from an external perspective.
Doug.
I mean, practically they're different, but keep in mind some jurisdictions have a very broad definition of unauthorized access to data, even if nothing's done with it. So I know some folks like to use the same internal incident process because they're different, but it's like a Venn diagram. Each one is unique. But given how broad privacy law is, you can't just assume they're completely detached from each other.
Well, so right now we're talking about stopping access, right, or data. How about the opposite? The need for data, I think everybody in the other panels recognized, especially from our research community, is growing. And given that it's growing, how do we handle that need against what's happening on the other side, which is the unauthorized scraping, and how do you prevent it? So where do you draw that balance? I don't know, if Doug or Veronica, do you want to start?
I mean, I feel like this goes to kind of the three caveats I wanted to mention. The first being, if this is interpreted too strictly, I think Timothy was going down this route earlier, you run the risk that the large platforms are consuming data from all sorts of third party sites too. And let's say a regulator finds that the users consent didn't cover what was being done, and the users didn't give consent for something, and there were technical controls sending that consent, but it's not enough. Well, is that a CFAA violation? Second thing to think about is the risk that an incorrectly created regulatory framework for scraping could inadvertently reinforce kind of data megaliths or monoliths. This happened a little bit with GDPR, and it came up in the last panel where unintentionally, and I don't describe any ill will to folks at Meta or Google, whoever, but unintentionally, a side effect of GDPR is it became very many ways a one-way sieve, and maybe that impacted how people responded technologically, if they could legally. And in Europe, it was such a severe thing that you're seeing follow-up legislation in both the Digital Services Act, but also the Digital Markets Act, which will require express two-way sharing of certain types of competitive data back to other platforms. And the third is about privacy, and this goes back to the researchers in particular, and ownership of data. Users should own their own data. This is basis for GDPR. Weaker a little bit under CCPA, weaker still under like the new Indian privacy law. But it's not a perfect model here. So let's say you had a social media network, and suddenly a lot of users wanted to move their stuff to a new social media network. So there's a tool. Each user goes in and scrapes their entire timeline to go to the new tool. It's a violation of the terms of service. The platform puts tools in place tooling to stop it. Are all those users now violating CFAA? It seems so in competition with the other. Is a researcher who's doing the same thing to try to vet someone's policy statements on what their platform is doing. Are they violating CFAA if they do the same thing as the users are doing? This is why it needs caution. It needs not just a one-size-fits-all regulatory solution for scraping.
Veronica, let me add something, unless you want to respond.
I'm just trying to secure my job, security for the rest of my life. You need more privacy people in the companies, in the startups, in public research, because privacy professionals sit at such a great place. Oftentimes I've found in speaking to peers and colleagues, they're probably the only one who speaks to legal and the engineering teams at the same time on a daily basis. They're the only ones talking to security teams on one side and also know what marketing is doing. It's a nice place to sit. And so you need those people. We talk about regulations, we talk about enforcement. How do we do this from a policy and framework perspective? But you also need people at the table saying, should we? Like, is that the way? Like, you need people both on the side of protecting your data. So you need the Sarahs of the world sitting inside the company saying this, we need more security controls, we need better terms, we need better contractual provisions, but you also need the people who are doing the product reviews and doing the, hey, do you think that we should create our entire company on data that we are just out there like with a net trying to grab? You need those people having those conversations on the ground and top of the regulations.
I'm starting to see a trend here. LinkedIn asks for more headcount. Jumio is asking for more. But that actually brings me to another area that does require more headcount, I think, from just past experience. How is the industry even fighting unauthorized scraping? And I don't know, Mike, you want to start? Or
Still trying to define what it is, first of all. All the lawyers have job security. Part of, part of it is defining what it is, and then it's deciding what are the things that we're actually trying to mitigate. Are we trying to, there are certain platforms, Twitter, for instance, sells its data. And so, their reasons for mitigating scraping are, because it directly goes against like part of what their market is in selling data. For us, it's around commitments that we've made publicly and living up to those commitments. For Etsy, it might be IP protection and copyright protection on behalf of the people that are actually selling products on the platform. And so there's a myriad of different incentives that are driving what we actually need to put in place as technical mitigations. And so I'll answer the question in two parts. I think what I've started to witness from managed service platforms, hosting companies and other things, they're starting to build in differentiators around bot detection, around security protections, around looking for patterns of what's actually happening in the activity, which I think is phenomenal. Because I think one of the concerns that I had as I delved into this space a few years ago, like to just focus on scraping, was, is this only going to be a thing that companies that have gotten to a certain point or publicly traded can solve? And what I'm really happy to see is this is something that like we're getting the technical foundations in place for companies to be able to solve it of all sizes. But we need to help them put teeth in the ability to enforce, because I think that is, what Sarah called out with HiQ and what's been called out in other cases, and even the Van Buren case that's been talked about a number of times here is, there's a ton of headwinds in trying to actually enforce and make sure that what you go enforce can be successful, but that you're also enforcing against the right things, and that's really hard. So hope I answered the question and just babbled.
So are there also technical things that people are doing that you're?
I mean, I think like talking to them, like rate limits and bot detection are a couple of them. I think starting to build new models of how I look at my own systems, not just through a security lens, but through a scraping lens, and using some of the things that we've learned in privacy and security and starting to tackle in scraping, having scraping teams that are dedicated on it as a problem space. The only way to solve scraping is to turn off the product. And we can't do that. For us, we have to have the data in the product for consumers to want to work with it, and for the company to even function, whether that's Facebook or Instagram. And so it's finding the right balance on controls. It's forcing some pages to be logged in that may have been logged out before. It's being really intelligent about product design, around policy, around everything that we do.
And Veronica, you want to talk about some of the enforcement things you've used in the past that may have worked? No? All right, so Doug, I'm just kidding.
I mean, takedowns can work to a certain point, but if it's the end user's content, it's a little harder. I think three things that work really well are: one, cross-functional working groups internally, like you were mentioning. When you're in the privacy and security side, you're dealing with everyone. So you're in a unique place to bring together a consensus, see what investment level can we do to fight this cross-industry. And then, to figure out best practices, to figure out what we can do and what works and what doesn't, when essentially just like intrusions and everything, it's a constant battle between one side and the other. And then finally, we need help from enforcement. There needs to be a clearinghouse or some sort of support in law enforcement, because any one incident is probably not big enough to get their attention, but the scale it's happening at is enough that some sort of enforcement and regulatory kind of cross-functional effort, I think, would help, especially with the malicious actors that are causing a lot of harm.
Have any of you dealt with just sending out takedown notices, and what kind of response do you get when you do that?
It's not a score we'd release publicly ever, but I think what I would share as an observation is I think a number of years ago, when we started to do this in recognizing it as a problem and seeing it as a growing trend, there was a lot of middle fingers and other things coming back to people responding to takedown notices or actions taken. And I think HiQ, as Supreme Court put down their ruling, we watched and observed professional scrapers that have services, if you just look at the tone of their marketing, change significantly. And I think what we've seen is like there have been more and more successes, and I think the response rate has improved. I think also all the companies, like I think all of us and everybody that's been a part of this today has gotten better at building the technical solutions that take the simplest type of scraping offline. And it's the more sophisticated actors that are left, which have more at stake. And so
Anybody want to add to that, or I can turn to the next question, which really is focused around regulators, right? Are referrals to regulators an area that should be explored? Is it successful? What are some of the roadblocks that you may have seen or expect to see? Referring, say, threat actors.
I think I think it would be, I think the benefits of the investment of time by industry and regulators would it would be kind of a benefit plus. The time is worth the energy put into it, along with some like reinforcing some norms and industry practices, be it about the way takedowns are handled, the way issues are shared with regulators. I guess it's some sort of clearinghouse model where regulators who have some ability to operate and share information across borders, across legal regimes, and to obtain information that we can't, would just make an outsized impact on solving this beyond just like a new law change, a new law passing, which again, it's only in the US, so it's not gonna matter for some of these large operators.
Veronica, Mike, did you want to add to?
With respect to regulators, I think the industry has to create some transparency around what exactly they want to mitigate against. Is it that they're worried that a competitor is going to come in and use their data to create a competitor? Is it that they're worried about the privacy of the individuals whose personal information they're stewards of? That's a legitimate issue. That's you're protecting the information. But there's a lot, when you read some of these cases, when you read some of the information out there, there's a lot of, well, scraping is bad because of X, but the underlying issues seem to kind of be a little bit grayer, or they meddle in terms of competitive versus personal information. So really speaking, getting people together, MUSA is great for this, right? Like you can have a standard, you can have transparency as to what is it we're trying to protect against, what is it that we're worried about in that space, and bringing into the public good and the scientific research side, making sure they have a seat at the table and that we're all transparent as to what it is to be unauthorized scraping versus what is the impact to the individual, the impact to the actual company.
I think it's a few things. I think the biggest problem today is the platform is the only one held accountable for these actions. We talked about Clearview AI, but when the fines are a fraction of what has been given to them by individual VCs, it's where is the harm and where are the teeth in this? And it's the other folks that scrape. It's when they scrape, when they create these data sets that they trade, when they become a data broker, when they set up the competitive or phishing sites, there is very little consequence for them. Any of us in this room can take a drive full of 5 billion records of information of consumers, as long as it doesn't contain health information, financial information, nation state information, and go sell it on any street corner in any street in any country and have zero consequences attached to it. Until some of that changes, it's going to be really hard and a really difficult shift. I will say, like, I'm also really grateful for MUSA and opening up the conversations. And I was fortunate to be a part of the MUSA event in the UK and the Tech UK, which I understand there's like a Tech UK publication came out today with some of the findings from those conversations, talking to the regulator directly and facilitating that conversation. That was very eye-opening for us and eye-opening for them. So I hope more and more of that continues to happen.
So a lot of, and I'm a perfect example of this. I came from some of the biggest companies in the world. What do you say to the small companies out there? How do they take on these challenges?
to basically use your resources wisely to protect your users and your platform as much as possible, to kind of work with organizations like this who can really help scale up industry-wide solutions, but also to kind of protect a vibrant and competitive economy that relies on data and competition and the ability for users to choose who to share their data with without it being locked up in one place.
Veronica?
At small companies, at startups, you don't have a lot of resources.
Yeah.
You don't. You've got one person working who's the CTO, who's also the CISO, who's also the CFO somehow. They're all working together. And I think that one of the most important parts for these small companies who are trying to innovate, who are trying to do these types of things, and again, I always split it. It's two sides. It's the company protecting from the scraping and the company wanting to scrape for some reason that might be unauthorized, right? Either way, you need, if you're the company trying to protect your data assets, you need to know what your data assets are and what value they bring to your company. So you understand your why. Why am I trying to prevent this unauthorized scraping? What is the issue at hand that I'm trying to prevent, the harm that I am trying to prevent? On the other side, if you are trying to innovate, if you are trying to do research, you also need to know your data assets. What are you actually trying to do? Like, do you have a legal basis for collecting this? Do you have a purpose? Are you just trying to see how much data you can get at all times? And like, you have to know your why, and that is going to influence how you approach it. You don't have a lot of resources, but you can if you are very precise and you say, okay, I have user data, I have end user data, personal data, I'm going to protect it in this way, and here are the structures I can put around that. It really just depends, but really knowing your data assets, I think, is probably the most important thing.
I've really appreciated that some of the points y'all brought up around like having the clearinghouse of information and making this available. I'll beat the drum again on frameworks, like all of us that as we're developing them and can develop them as an industry and work with MUSA to share some of the best practices and other things. Like I think that's going to go a long way towards helping small, medium businesses. I think the more that companies that do invest can open source and do things around sharing findings and including transparency around some of these things, I think it's really important as well to like sharing these examples and helping identify the problems. I think, and then I also love the example of choose good. Like you're building a startup, like make sure that you have, you know the provenance of data you're buying or that you're either acquiring or getting somehow. And just because you buy it from somebody doesn't mean it wasn't gotten in ill-gotten ways.
So, well, first, I don't know if anybody noticed, but not been a perfect YouTube video that Veronica just did on how, if you're a small company, to handle scraping. But overall, though, we're now talking about companies working together, right? Let's talk about public, private. I mean, that was the whole point of why the alliance was formed in the first place. It seems like a good place to end it, which is what should be the public-private dialogue with regulators or other policymakers with the industry. How do we approach that? How do we get that dialogue to open up? I know Tech UK had an event about a month and a half ago. That was one of the first ones in the world. So it's now time for that. So how do we approach it so it's a success story as opposed to there was a battle that just didn't seem to get anywhere? Anybody want to start? Doug?
I think it begins with how we began today, which is figuring out what the shared goals are. And recognizing where the risks are from over or under regulating, that maybe there's more than one problem to be solved, and who the best partners are to get that done in both the public and the private sphere. I think it's really, really important to get all those stakeholders in the room to make sure that kind of that full cross section are there, but also to take the time to go from discussion to the next step of kind of catalyzing some sort of initial action that maybe won't solve all the problems, but could get us part of the way there in a visible way that shows people something can be done so that it'll just get the ball rolling.
I've worked for large organizations, I've worked for small organizations, and I go back to like limited resources. Sometimes you don't have the ability to talk to regulators directly. You don't.
No.
But you can seek out peers in your industry and talk to them. What are they doing? What are your outside counsels doing? They have resources that are far above yours. So seeking out peers in the industry, aligning on your goals, aligning on what you're actually trying to do, and then looking for solutions there. I previously sat, SOMAR is a research organization. I previously sat on their legal affairs committee. We had a great opportunity as a representative for Comscore to go to the EU and talk to them and speak to regulators directly. You don't always get that opportunity in a smaller space. And so, but now we work with our outside counsels to do that type of commenting or to flag for us issues globally that we might want to address. So it's really just trying to see where you have the most benefit for the least amount of resources.
Yeah, it's I would agree with all of that. I think on top of it, it's it's helping identify what the industry standard is and really working towards like codifying that, because that we can't have regulatory conversations without all agreeing on what should be the expectation from a technology perspective or ability to enforce or obligations around research and other things. And so I think that is where the conversations have to start, and they're going to be difficult conversations because it doesn't exist. It hasn't come out of academia and it hasn't come out of the commercial space yet. I think one of the other places for small and medium businesses that I think is going to be really influential is like as they learn about their data being scraped, as they learn about unauthorized scraping, putting their business at risk, is also the people that produce the enterprise products, the managed service providers and others that can provide some of this at scale. Where they themselves build these services for their own products in Amazon's case, in Microsoft's case, and others, and really working with where they're buying their services to help provide some of that protection, which will be much easier when we have frameworks. Did I say that yet?
That's actually perfect time to go to the audience if there's questions around this topic, since we're a few minutes left here. Since we're last panel, we're between you and the
Everybody get a drink and then we'll answer questions.
But anyway, so any questions in the audience? We see a hand over here on the left.
Can you raise it?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. So I think one of the things that I took away from this session, which is that slightly different from the sort of discussion we had in the previous sessions, where I think we were more categorical about, the panels overall, or were more categorical about scraping needing to be banned as a policy position and like limited exceptions perhaps being made in certain cases. But I think one of the things that Veronica pointed out is that might not necessarily be the best solution, because you're looking for something that's more of a balance between companies like Microsoft and companies like Jumio. And so I was wondering, do you feel that instead of privacy laws being the way forward, which was the takeaway from the past session, something like a self-regulatory framework or partnerships with industry bodies, as you pointed out, would be like a better framework? And like, is that something that you think would work better as compared to a law?
We do not scrape.
No, I mean, like not scraping in that sense, but like
not part of our product or our model. And I have issues with self-regulatory frameworks. I don't always think that they are the best route. They don't always work very well. But that being said, I think it is, in the last panel, they talked about this. I don't think there's one solution. I think it is 10 different solutions at different types of levels, so that you do have more enforcement on the people who are misusing the data. Why should a company who is protecting the data to the extent they can be penalized when there's a company on the other hand that is just doing what they want and it's a Wild West? So you really have to, it's not one over the other. It is all of the above, and trying to figure out what those controls are that you're going to put in place that actually click in that moment in time. And then knowing that even though it's in that moment in time, technology is just going at a pace that the law cannot keep up with. So knowing that it is not a point in time solution, but that these types of things that you're doing are going to have to change as technology changes and the world changes.
Anyone want to add to that?
I think it's one of those things like buying a bike at a pawn shop. Was it stolen or not? And I think that's it's less about self-governance of the companies on, because we have so many sides to this marketplace. We have the companies that where data is scraped from. We have the companies that are doing the scraping. And then we have customers of the companies that did the scraping, and perhaps customers of those customers. And so it's really understanding the provenance of data. It's really setting expectations in the same way that we have expectations that the data center we're using, has, certain environmental and green features, that we're not wasting electricity and wasting other natural resources. We should have the same expectation around data that's passed through a marketplace as well. We should, we have to build these expectations, and that's where, I don't know that a law today is necessarily that. But when we lack the judicial precedent for any of us to really have full teeth in enforcement in all cases, and for us to be able to enforce on all kinds of scraping that is bad, or even just observe it and know it's happening. I think that was an interesting thing that I heard earlier is, I don't think scraping is as observable as people think it is, and what it takes to actually identify it.
Other questions? No other questions?
There's another one more back there.
Last question.
Are you sure?
You don't want the reception?
Thanks. I think at the outset you talked about getting rid of the supply of data, but the demand continuing to go up, and that a lot of the folks who have been on these panels, either privacy professionals or work at bodies or companies where user data and data in general is a vehicle for monetization for the company, but also kind of their part of their IP. But that monetization piece is really kind of where the friction, we haven't really invested as a space in creating that friction. So what do you all think about entities, throwing out companies like Stripe, who don't necessarily have data to scrape, but are the mechanism through which the monetization for scraping happens? So how do we take MUSA or this privacy space in general and expand it to parties that aren't directly involved, but are the ones who are used by legitimate or illegitimate actors to make money off the data that they're scraping?
In a way, what I'm hearing from that question is the supply chain. How do you attack the supply chain? Anybody want to answer?
I think attack's a poor term, because I think companies have dealt with this, especially through fraud and especially through other things that have happened. Stripe is in a really tough place in a lot of cases, but they make a lot of money along the way. And so figuring out a balance of, when a violation occurs of terms, it's hard. Are we going to hold Stripe accountable to your terms of service and somebody violating it? And that's where, unless it's actually violating a law, it creates a lot of challenges. And it goes back to the heart of the gaps in the regulatory space. The gaps of any of these actions being illegal makes it really difficult for them. Makes it difficult for app stores. Just because somebody's violating your terms of service, does that necessarily mean it's a violation of the App Store's policies? And I think that's a to-be debated case that hopefully MUSA tackles.
I'll just say, essentially, that issue is a trust and safety problem. And trust and safety problems, the less clear the rules are, the harder they are to resolve, which is a whole other issue I think all three of us deal with sometimes. So resolving the other questions we have here would make that type of secondary enforcement a lot easier too.
Right, and I think what that basically boils down to is collaboration. Sometimes collaboration can solve problems that the written word cannot. So with that, I'm going to thank our panelists. This was a fascinating conversation, and I do want to give you all, if you have anything else you want to add before we let these folks go to the other side of the wall. Anybody?
None of this was legal advice.
I am more privacy people.
I'm really excited to see, I heard we had hundreds of people online, so I appreciate like MUSA putting this together. It's a big deal. This is a conversation. Like I said, I don't feel lonely like working in this space because I've gotten to meet a lot of other folks today and talk to a bunch of other folks here and hopefully meet more of you over time. But I really appreciate Hemu, Venable, MUSA, and everything and everybody for pulling this together. It's a great start. I have never sat through a first one of these conferences from kind of a trade association perspective where there weren't just the 3 people that sent out the invites sitting in the audience. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I do want to say, and I truly appreciate that, and thank you for that kind word. I want to first wrap it all up for you. And magically, my team knew what the takeaways were going to be, and they wrote me a speech. So this was one of the first of many. As Mike was saying, usually you do get 3 people in a room when the alliance forms and you hold a meeting. We had over 250 online guests registered and over 50-something people in this room. That to me is absolutely fascinating. What did we learn today? We learned that a dialogue has to happen. The challenge around defining and regulating unauthorized scraping is incredible, but it's solvable. And it over time will be more and more and more successful. The other is the importance of understanding and addressing user impact. A lot of times people wonder what that is. One of the things we're hearing from this panel as well as the others is there is a conversation to be had to better understand that. The third is the importance of understanding the unique challenges that companies face. I think if you hear from the different companies that were represented, they all brought a different perspective, a different challenge, a different purpose, maybe this is not one problem I need to solve, but it is for somebody else. That one is mine, that one is yours. And yet there's a collaboration need, and there's a huge opportunity here to identify the solutions and foster a public-private dialogue. I think one of the first things that we started a while back was, how do we make that happen? And we realized the way you make it happen is you create a really fancy logo and tell people it's an alliance and bring people together because they show up, especially in Washington, D.C. But then we go from here. You're going to see more of these conversations, whether it's around how do you attack this issue? How do you bring collaboration? How do you foster that discussion that's happening, not only in the audience, and I'm sure many of your thoughts are going through, I have a question, maybe I don't want to ask. Well, there'll be so many opportunities to do that. So before, though, I do let you go, I do have to do something that's always important, sometimes forgotten, is to thank certain people that I'm going to call your name and you have to stand up because you're on live TV right now. So you got to stand up. So first one is Maya, Nicole, Paige, Sarah, and Ashna. Where are you all? You got to stand up and take a round of applause here because these are the folks that put this together. Without this, none of it would have happened. Without all the efforts they put into it, we wouldn't have had this kind of dialogue happen today. So if you want to learn more about MUSA, go to the antiscrapingalliance.org website. It's listed somewhere in the little fancy things that you got at the door. And now it's time to do what everybody's been waiting for, networking, reception on the other side of the wall. So thank you all for coming and have a good evening.